The Cybrarian presents Robert E. Howard's Kull, the Conqueror. In the time of Bran MacMor, Kings of the Night.
Disclaimer. The following may contain violence, references to sex, and language that may offend.
Part 1. The Caesar lolled on his ivory throne. His iron legions came to break a king in a land unknown and a race without a name. The Song of Bran. The dagger flashed downward. A sharp cry broke in a gasp. The form on the rough altar twitched convulsively and lay still. The jagged flint edge sawed at the crimson breast, and thin, bony fingers, ghastly dyed, tore out the still, twitching heart. Under matted white brows, sharp eyes gleamed with a ferocious intensity. Beside the slayer, 4 men stood about the crude pile of stones that formed the altar of the god of shadows. One was of medium height, lithely built, scantily clad, whose black hair was confined by a narrow iron band, in the centre of which gleamed a single red jewel. Of the others, 2 were dark like the first, but where he was lithe they were stocky and misshapen, with knotted limbs and tangled hair falling over sloping brows. His face denoted intelligence and implacable will, theirs merely a beast-like ferocity. The 4th man had little in common with the rest. Nearly a head taller, though his hair was black as theirs, his skin was comparatively light, and he was grey-eyed. He eyed the proceedings with little favour, and in truth, Cormac of Connacht was little at ease. The druids of his own Isle of Erin had strange, dark rites of worship, but nothing like this. Dark trees shut in this grim scene, lit by a single torch. Through the branches moaned an eerie night wind. Cormac was alone among men of a strange race, and he had just seen the heart of a man ripped from his still pulsing body. Now the ancient priest, who scarcely looked human, was glaring at the throbbing thing. Cormac shuddered, glancing at him who wore the jewel. Did Bran MacMor, king of the Picts, believe that this white-bearded old butcher could foretell events by scanning a bleeding human heart? The dark eyes of the king were inscrutable. There were strange depths to the man that Cormac could not fathom, nor any other man.
The portents are good,
exclaimed the priest wildly, speaking more to the 2 chieftains than to Bran.
Here, from the pulsing heart of a captive Roman I read. Defeat for the arms of Rome. Triumph for the sons of the Heather.
The 2 savages murmured beneath their breath, their fierce eyes smouldering.
Go and prepare your clans for battle,
said the king, and they lumbered away with the ape-like gait assumed by such stunted giants. Paying no more heed to the priest, who was examining the ghastly ruin on the altar, Bran beckoned to Cormac. The Gael followed him with alacrity. Once out of that grim grove, under the starlight, he breathed more freely. They stood on an eminence, looking out over long, swelling undulations of gently waving heather. Near at hand, a few fires twinkled, their fewness giving scant evidence of the hordes of tribesmen who lay close by. Beyond these were more fires, and beyond these still more, which last marked the camp of Cormac's own men, hard-riding, hard-fighting Gaels, who were of that band which was just beginning to get a foothold on the western coast of Caledonia, the nucleus of what was later to become the Kingdom of Dal Riadea. To the left of these, other fires gleamed, and far away to the south were more fires, mere pinpoints of light. But even at that distance, the Pictish king and his Celtic ally could see that these fires were laid out in regular order.
The fires of the legions,
muttered Bran.
the fires that have lit a path around the world. The men who light those fires have trampled the races under their iron heels. And now, we of the Heather have our backs to the wall. What will fall on the morrow? Victory for us, says the priest,
answered Cormac. Bran made an impatient gesture.
Moonlight on an ocean. Wind in the fir tops. Do you think that I put faith in such mummery? Or that I enjoy the butchery of a captive legionary? I must hearten my people. It was for Gron and Bakar that I let old Gunnar read the portents. The warriors will fight better. And Gunnar?
Bran laughed.
Gunnar is too old to believe anything. He was a high priest of the shadows, a score of years before I was born. He claims direct descent from that Gunnar who was a wizard in the days of Brule, the spear slayer, who was the first of my line. No man knows how old he is. Sometimes I think he is the original Gunnar himself.
At least,
said a mocking voice, and Cormac started as a dim shape appeared at his side.
At least I have learned that in order to keep the faith and trust of the people, a wise man must appear to be a fool. I know secrets that would blast even your brain, Bran. Should I speak them? But in order that the people may believe in me, I must descend to such things as they think proper magics, and prance and yell and rattle snake skins, and dabble about in human blood and chicken livers.
Cormac looked at the ancient with a new interest. The semi-madness of his appearance had vanished. He was no longer the charlatan, the spell-mumbling shaman. The starlight lent him a dignity which seemed to increase his very height, so that he stood like a white-bearded patriarch.
Bran, your doubt lies there.
The lean arm pointed to the fourth ring of fires.
Aye.
The king nodded gloomily.
Cormac, you know as well as I. Tomorrow's battle hinges upon that circle of fires, with the chariots of the Britons and your own western horsemen. Our success would be certain, but surely the devil himself is in the heart of every Northman. You know how I trapped that band, how they swore to fight for me against Rome, and now that their chief Ragnar is dead, they swear that they will be led only by a king of their own race. Else they will break their vow and go over to the Romans. Without them we are doomed.
for we cannot change our former plan.
Take heart, Bran,
said Gunnar.
Touch the jewel in your iron crown. Mayhap it will bring you aid.
Bran laughed bitterly. Now you talk as the people think. I am no fool to twist with empty words. What of the gem? It is a strange one, truth, and has brought me luck ere now. But I need now no jewels, but the allegiance of 300 fickle Northmen, who are the only warriors among us, who may stand the charge of the legions on foot.
But the jewel, Bran, the jewel,
persisted Gunnar. Well, the jewel? Cried Bran impatiently. It is older than this world. It was old when Atlantis and Lemuria sank into the sea. It was given to Brule, the spear slayer, first of my line, by the Atlantean Kull, king of Valusia, in the days when the world was young. But shall that profit us now?
Who knows?
Asked the wizard, obliquely.
Time and space exist not. There was no past, and there shall be no future. Now is all. All things that ever were, are, or ever will be, transpire now. Man is forever at the centre of what we call time and space. I have gone into yesterday and tomorrow, and both were as real as today, which is like the dreams of ghosts. But let me sleep and talk with Gunnar. Mayhap he shall aid us.
What means he? Asked Cormac, with a slight twitching of his shoulders, as the priest strode away in the shadows. He has ever said that the first Gunnar comes to him in his dreams and talks with him, answered Bran. I have seen him perform deeds that seemed beyond human ken. I know not. I am but an unknown king with an iron crown, trying to lift a race of savages out of the slime into which they have sunk. Let us look to the camps. As they walked, Cormac wondered, by what strange freak of fate had such a man risen among this race of savages, saviours of a darker, grimmer age? Surely he was an atavism, an original type of the days when the Picts ruled all Europe, before their primitive empire fell before the bronze swords of the Gauls. Cormac knew how Bran, rising by his own efforts from the neglected position of the son of a wolf clan chief, had to an extent united the tribes of the Heather, and now claimed kingship over all Caledon. But his rule was loose, and much remained before the Pictish clans would forget their feuds and present a solid front to foreign foes. On the Battle of the Morrow, the first pitched battle between the Picts under their king and the Romans, hinged the future of the rising Pictish kingdom. Bran and his ally walked through the Pictish camp, where the swart warriors lay sprawled about their small fires, sleeping or gnawing on half-cooked food. Cormac was impressed by their silence. 1,000 men camped here, yet the only sounds were occasional low guttural intonations. The silence of the Stone Age rested in the souls of these men. They were all short, most of them crooked of limb, giant dwarves. Bran MacMorn was a tall man among them. Only the older men were bearded, and they scantily, but their black hair fell about their eyes so that they peered fiercely from under the tangle. They were barefoot, and clad scantily in wolfskin. Their arms consisted in short barbed swords of iron, heavy black bows, arrows tipped with flint, iron and copper, and stone-headed mallets. Defensive armour they had none, save for a crude shield of hide-covered wood. Many had worked bits of metal into their tangled manes, as a slight protection against sword cuts. Some few, sons of long lines of chiefs, were smooth-limbed and lithe like Bran, but in the eyes of all gleamed the unquenchable savagery of the primeval. These men are fully savages, thought Cormac. Worse than the Gauls, Britons, and Germans. Can the old legends be true, that they reigned in a day when strange cities rose, where now the sea rolls? And they survived the flood that washed those gleaming empires under, sinking again into that savagery from which they once had risen. Close to the encampment of the tribesmen were the fires of a group of Britons, members of fierce tribes who lived south of the Roman wall, but who dwelt in the hills and forests to the west, and defied the power of Rome. Powerfully built men they were, with blazing blue eyes and shocks of tousled yellow hair, such men as had thronged the Kentish beaches when Caesar brought the eagles to the Isles. These men, like the Picts, wore no armour, and were clad scantily in coarse-worked cloth and deerskin sandals. They bore small, round bucklers of hard wood, braced with bronze, to be worn on the left arm, and long, heavy bronze swords with blunt points. Some had bows, though the Britons were indifferent archers. Their bows were shorter than the Picts, and effective only at close range. But ranged close by the fires were the weapons that made the name Briton a word of terror to Pict, Roman, and Norse raider alike. Within the circle of firelight stood 50 bronze chariots, with long, cruel blades curving out from their sides. One of these blades could dismember half a dozen men at once. Tethered close by, under the vigilant eyes of their guards, grazed the chariots' horses. Big, rangy steeds, swift and powerful. Would that we had more of them, mused Bran. With 1,000 chariots, and my bowmen, I could drive the legions into the sea. The free British tribes must eventually fall before Rome, said Cormac. It would seem they would rush to join you in war. Bran made a helpless gesture. The fickleness of the Celt. They cannot forget old feuds. Our ancient men have told us how they would not even unite against Caesar when the Romans first came. They would not make head against a common foe together. These men came to me because of some dispute with their chief, but I cannot depend on them when they are not actually fighting. Cormac nodded. I know. Caesar conquered Gaul by playing one tribe against another. My own people shift and change with the waxing and waning of the tides, but of all Celts, the Cymrae are the most changeable, the least stable. Not many centuries ago, my own Gaelic ancestors wrested Arran from the Cymric Danans, because though they outnumber us, they opposed us as separate tribes, rather than as a nation. And so these Cymric Britons face Rome, said Bran. These will aid us on the morrow. Further, I cannot say. But how shall I expect loyalty from alien tribes, who am not sure of my own people? Thousands lurk in the hills, holding aloof. I am king in name only. Let me win tomorrow, and they will flock to my standard. If I lose, they will scatter like birds before a cold wind. A chorus of rough welcome greeted the two leaders as they entered the camp of Cormac's Gaels. 500 in number they were, tall, rangy men, black-haired and grey-eyed mainly, with the bearing of men who lived by war alone. While there was nothing like close discipline among them, there was an air of more system and practical order that existed in the lines of the Picts and Britons. These men were of the last Celtic race to invade the Isles, and their barbaric civilization was of much higher order than that of their Cymric kin. The ancestors of the Gaels had learned the arts of war on the vast plains of Scythia and at the courts of the Pharaohs, where they had fought as mercenaries of Egypt, and much of what they learned they brought into Ireland with them. Excelling in metalwork, they were armed, not with clumsy bronze swords, but with high-grade weapons of iron. They were clad in well-woven kilts and leathern sandals. Each wore a light shirt of chain mail and a visorless helmet, but this was all their defensive armour. Celts, Gaelic, or Brythonic, were prone to judge a man's valour by the amount of armour he wore. The Britons who faced Caesar deemed the Romans cowards because they cased themselves in metal. And many centuries later, the Irish clans thought the same of the mail-clad Norman knights of Strongbow. Cormac's warriors were horsemen. They neither knew nor esteemed the use of the bow. They bore the inevitable round metal-braced buckler, dirks, long straight swords and light single-handed axes. Their tethered horses grazed not far away, big-boned animals, not so ponderous as those raised by the Britons, but swifter. Bran's eyes lighted as these two strode through the camp.
These men are keen-beaked birds of war. See how they whet their axes, and jest of the morrow. Would that the raiders in yon camp were as staunch as your men, Cormac. Then I would greet the legions with a laugh when they come up from the south tomorrow.
They were entering the circle of the Northman fires. 300 men sat about gambling, whetting their weapons and drinking deep of the heather ale, furnished them by their Pictish allies. These gazed upon Bran and Cormac with no great friendliness. It was striking to note the difference between them and the Picts and Celts. The difference in their cold eyes, their strong, moody faces, their very bearing. Here was ferocity and savagery, but not of the wild, upbursting fury of the Celt. Here was a fierceness backed by grim determination and stolid stubbornness. The charge of the British clans was terrible, overwhelming. But they had no patience. Let them be balked of immediate victory, and they were likely to lose heart and scatter, or fall back to bickering among themselves. There was the patience of the cold blue north in these seafarers, a lasting determination that would keep them steadfast to the bitter end, once their face was set toward a definite goal. As to personal stature, they were giants, massive yet rangy. That they did not share the ideas of the Celts regarding armour was shown by the fact that they were clad in heavy scale mail shirts that reached below mid-thigh, heavy horned helmets and hardened hide leggings, reinforced, as were their shoes, with plates of iron. Their shields were huge oval affairs of hard wood, hide and brass. As to weapons, they had long iron-headed spears, heavy iron axes and daggers. Some had wide-bladed swords. Cormac scarcely felt at ease with the cold magnetic eyes of these flaxen-haired men fixed upon him. He and they were hereditary foes, even though they did chance to be fighting on the same side at present. But were they? A man came forward, a tall, gaunt warrior on whose scarred, wolfish face the flickering firelight reflected deep shadows. With his wolfskin mantle flung carelessly about his wide shoulders, and the great horns on his helmet adding to his height, he stood there in the swaying shadows, like some half-human thing, a brooding shape of the dark barbarism that was soon to engulf the world.
"Well, Wulfhere,"
said the Pictish king,
"you have drunk the mead of counsel, and have spoken about the fires. What is your decision?"
The Northman's eyes flashed in the gloom.
"Give us a king of our own race to follow. If you wish us to fight for you."
Bran flung out his hands. Ask me to drag down the stars to gem your helmets. Will not your comrades follow you?
Not against the legions,
answered Wulfhere sullenly.
A king led us on the Viking path. A king must lead us against the Romans. And Ragnar is dead.
I am a king, said Bran. Will you fight for me? If I stand at the tip of your fight wedge?
A king of your own race,
said Wulfhere doggedly.
We are all picked men of the north. We fight for none but the king. And the king must lead us against the legions.
Cormac sensed a subtle threat in this repeated phrase. Here is a Prince of Erin, said Bran. Will you fight for the Westerner?
We fight under no kilt, west or east,
growled the Viking, and a low rumble of approval rose from the onlookers.
It is enough to fight by their side.
The hot Gallic blood rose in Cormac's brain, and he pushed past Bran, his hand on his sword.
How mean you that, pirate?
Before Wulfhere could reply, Bran interposed.
Have done.
Will you fools throw away the battle before it is fought? By your madness. What of your oath, Wulfhere?
We swore it under Ragnar. When he died from a Roman arrow, we were absolved of it. We will only follow a king against the legions.
But your comrades will follow you against the Heather people, snapped Bran.
Aye.
The Northman's eyes met his brazenly.
Send us a king, or we join the Romans tomorrow.
Bran snarled. In his rage, he dominated the scene, dwarfing the huge men who towered over him. Traitors! Liars! I hold your lives in my hand. Aye, draw your swords if you will. Cormac, keep your blade in its sheath. These wolves will not bite a king. Wulfhere, I spared your lives when I could have taken them. You came to raid the countries of the south, sweeping down from the northern sea in your galleys. You ravaged the coasts, and the smoke of burning villages hung like a cloud over the shores of Caledon. I trapped you all when you were pillaging and burning, with the blood of my people on your hands. I burned your long ships and ambushed you when you followed, with thrice the number of bowmen who burned for your lives hidden in the heathered hills about you. I spared you when we could have shot you down like trapped wolves. Because I spared you, you swore to come and fight for me.
And shall we die because the Picts fight Rome?
Rumbled a bearded raider. Your lives are forfeit to me. You came to ravage the south. I did not promise to send you all back to your homes in the north, unharmed and loaded with loot. Your vow was to fight one battle against Rome under my standard. Then I will aid your survivors to build ships, and you may go where you will, with a goodly share of the plunder we take from the legions. Ragnar had kept his oath. But Ragnar died in a skirmish with Roman scouts, and now you, Wulfhere the dissension breeder, you stir up your comrades to dishonour themselves by that which a Northman hates, the breaking of the sworn word.
We break no oath,
snarled the Viking, and the king sensed the basic Germanic stubbornness, far harder to combat than the fickleness of the fiery Celts.
Give us a king, neither Pict, Gael nor Briton, and we will die for you. If not, then we will fight tomorrow for the greatest of all kings, the Emperor of Rome.
For a moment, Cormac thought that the Pictish king, in his black rage, would draw and strike the Northman dead. The concentrated fury that blazed in Bran's dark eyes caused Wulfhere to recoil and drop a hand to his belt.
Fool,
said MacMorn, in a low voice that vibrated with passion.
I could sweep you from the earth before the Romans are near enough to hear your death howls. Choose. Fight for me on the morrow, or die tonight under a black cloud of arrows, a red storm of swords, and a dark wave of chariots.
At the mention of the chariots, the only arm of war that had ever broken the Norse shield wall, Wulfhere changed expression, but he held his ground.
War be it,
he said doggedly,
or a king to lead us.
The Northman responded with a short, deep roar and a clash of swords on shields. Bran, eyes blazing, was about to speak again when a white shape glided silently into the ring of firelight.
Soft words,
said old Gunnar tranquilly.
King, say no more. Wulfhere, you and your fellows will fight for us if you have a king to lead you.
They have sworn.
Then be at ease,
quoth the wizard.
For ere battle joins on the morrow, I will send you such a king as no man on earth has followed for 100,000 years. A king neither Pict, Gael nor Britain, but one to whom the Emperor of Rome is but a village headman.
While they stood, undecided, Gunnar took the arms of Cormac and Bran.
Come. And you, Northman, remember your vow and my promise, which I have never broken. Sleep now, nor think to steal away in the darkness to the Roman camp. For if you escaped our shafts, you would not escape either my curse or the suspicions of the legionaries.
So the three walked away, and Cormac, looking back, saw Wulfhere standing by the fire, fingering his golden beard, with a look of puzzled anger on his lean, evil face. The three walked silently through the waving heather, under faraway stars, while the weird night wind whispered ghostly secrets about them.
Ages ago,
said the wizard suddenly,
in the days when the world was young, great lands rose where now the ocean roars. On these lands thronged mighty nations and kingdoms. Greatest of all these was Valusia, land of enchantment. Rome is a village compared to the splendors of the cities of Valusia, and the greatest king was Kull, who came from the land of Atlantis to wrest the crown of Valusia from a degenerate dynasty. The Picts who dwelt in the Isles, which now form the mountain peaks of a strange land upon the western ocean, were allies of Valusia, and the greatest of all the Pictish war chiefs was Brule, the spear slayer, first of the line men call MacMorn. Kull gave to Brule the jewel which you now wear in your iron crown, O king. After a strange battle in a dim land, and down the long ages it has come to us, ever a sign of the Macmorn, a symbol of former greatness, when at last the sea rose and swallowed Valusia, Atlantis, and Lemuria. Only the Picts survived, and they were scattered and few. Yet they began again the slow climb upward, and though many of the arts of civilization were lost in the Great Flood, yet they progressed. The art of metal working was lost, so they excelled in the working of flint, and they ruled all the new lands flung up by the sea, and now called Europe, until down from the north came younger tribes who had scarce risen from the ape when Valusia reigned in her glory, and who, dwelling in the icy lands about the pole, knew not of the lost splendour of the 7 empires, and little of the flood that had swept away half a world. And still they have come, Aryans, Celts, Germans, swarming down from the great cradle of their race, which lies near the pole. So again was the growth of the Pictish nation checked, and the race hurled into savagery, erased from the earth on the fringe of the world. With our backs to the wall we fight. Here in Caledon is the last stand of a once mighty race, and we change. Our people have mixed with the savages of an elder age, which we drove into the north when we came into the Isles, and now, save for their chieftains such as thou, Bran, a Pict is strange and abhorrent to look upon.
True, true, said the king impatiently. But what has that to do with...
Kull, king of Valusia,
said the wizard imperturbably,
was a barbarian in his age, as thou art in thine, though he ruled a mighty empire by the weight of his sword. Gunnar, friend to Brule, your first ancestor, has been dead 100,000 years as we reckon time. Yet I talked with him a scant hour agone.
You talked with his ghost?
Or he with mine? Did I go back 100,000 years, or did he come forward? If he came to me out of the past, it is not I who talked with a dead man, but he who talked with a man unborn. Past, present, and future are one to a wise man. I talked to Gunnar while he was alive. Likewise was I alive. In a timeless, spaceless land we met, and he told me many things.
The land was growing light with the birth of dawn. The heather waved and bent in long rows before the dawn wind, as bowing in worship of the rising sun.
The jewel in your crown is a magnet that draws down the eons,
said Gunnar.
The sun is rising, and who comes out of the sunrise?
Cormac and the king started, The sun was just lifting a red orb above the eastern hills, and full in the glow, etched boldly against the golden rim, a man suddenly appeared. They had not seen him come. Against the golden birth of day he loomed colossal, a gigantic god from the dawn of creation. Now, as he strode toward them, the walking host saw him and sent up a sudden shout of wonder.
"Who or what is it?"
exclaimed Bran.
"Let us go to meet him, Bran,"
answered the wizard.
"He is the king Gunnar has sent to save the people of Brul."
Chapter 2. I have reached these lands but newly, from an ultimate dim thule, from a wild weird clime that lieth sublime, out of space, out of time. Poe. The army fell silent as Bran, Cormac and Gunnar went toward the stranger who approached in long, swinging strides. As they neared him, the illusion of monstrous size vanished, but they saw he was a man of great stature. At first Cormac thought him to be a Northman, but a second glance told him that nowhere before had he seen such a man. He was built much like the Vikings, at once massive and lithe, tigerish, but his features were not as theirs, and his square-cut, lion-like mane of hair was as black as Bran's own. Under heavy brows glittered eyes grey as steel and cold as ice. His bronzed face, strong and inscrutable, was clean-shaven, and the broad forehead betokened a high intelligence, just as the firm jaw and thin lips showed willpower and courage. But more than all, the bearing of him, the unconscious lion-like stateliness, marked him as a natural king, a ruler of men. Sandals of curious make were on his feet, and he wore a pliant coat of strangely meshed mail, which came almost to his knees. A broad belt with a great golden buckle encircled his waist, supporting a long, straight sword in a heavy leather scabbard. His hair was confined by a wide, heavy golden band about his head. Such was the man who paused before the silent group. He seemed slightly puzzled, slightly amused. Recognition flickered in his eyes. He spoke in a strange, archaic Pictish, which Cormac scarcely understood. His voice was deep and resonant.
"Huh. Brule. Gunnar did not tell me I would dream of you."
For the first time in his life, Cormac saw the Pictish king completely thrown off his balance. He gaped, speechless. The stranger continued.
"And wearing the gem I gave you, in a circlet on your head. Last night you wore it in a ring on your finger."
"Last night?" gasped Bran.
"Last night, on 100,000 years ago, all one,"
murmured Gunnar, in evident enjoyment of the situation.
"I am not Brule," said Bran. "Are you mad to thus speak of a man dead 100,000 years? He was first of my line."
The stranger laughed unexpectedly.
Well, now I know I am dreaming. This will be a tale to tell, Brule, when I waken on the morrow, that I went into the future and saw men claiming descent from the Spear Slayer, who is as yet not even married. No, you are not Brule. I see now, though you have his eyes and his bearing. But he is taller and broader in the shoulders, yet you have his jewel. Oh well, anything can happen in a dream, so I will not quarrel with you. For a time I thought I had been transported to some other land in my sleep, and was in reality awake in a strange country, for this is the clearest dream I ever dreamed. Who are you? I am Bran MacMahon, king of the Caledonian Picts, and this ancient is Gunnar, a wizard of the line of Gunnar, and this warrior is Cormac Naconacht, a prince of the Isle of Erin.
The stranger shook his lion-like head.
These words sound strangely to me, save Gunnar, and that one is not Gunnar, though he too is old. What land is this? Caledon, or Alba, as the Gaels call it. And who are those squat ape-like warriors who watch us yonder, all agape? They are the Picts who own my rule. How strangely distorted folk are in dreams, muttered the stranger. And who are those shock-headed men about the chariots? They are the Britons, come right from south of the wall. What wall? The wall built by Rome to keep the people of the Heather out of Britain. Britain.
The tone was curious.
I have never heard of that land. And what is Rome? What? Cried Bran. You've never heard of Rome, the empire that rules the world? No empire rules the world, answered the other haughtily. The mightiest kingdom on earth is that wherein I reign. And who are you? Kull of Atlantis, king of Valusia.
Cormac felt a coldness trickle down his spine. The cold, grey eyes were unswerving. But this was incredible, monstrous, unnatural. Valusia! Cried Bran. Why, man, the sea waves have rolled over the spires of Valusia for untold centuries. Kull laughed outright. What a mad nightmare this is. When Gunnar put on me the spell of deep sleep last night, or this night, in the secret room of the inner palace, he told me I would dream strange things. But this is more fantastic than I reckoned. And the strangest thing is, I know I am dreaming. Gunnar interposed as Bran would have spoken.
Question not the acts of the gods,
muttered the wizard.
You are king because, in the past, you have seen and seized opportunities. The gods, or the first Gunnar, have sent you this man. Let me deal with them.
Bran nodded, and while the silent army gaped in speechless wonder, just within earshot, Gunnar spoke.
O great king, you dream, but is not all life a dream? How reckon you but that your former life is but a dream from which you have just awakened? Now we, dream folk, have our wars and our peace. And just now a great host comes up from the south to destroy the people of Brule. Will you aid us?
Kull grinned with pure zest.
Aye, I have fought battles in dreams ere now. I have slain and been slain, and was amazed when I woke from my visions. And at times, as now, dreaming I have known I dreamed. See, I'll pinch myself and feel it, but I know I dream, for I have felt the pain of fierce wounds in dreams. Yes, people of my dream, I will fight for you against the other dream folk. Where are they?
and that you enjoy the dream more,
said the wizard subtly.
Forget that it is a dream, and pretend that by the magic of the first Gunnar, and the quality of the jewel you gave to Brull, that now gleams on the crown of the Morny, you have in truth been transported forward into another wilder age, where the people of Brull fight for their life against a stronger foe.
For a moment, the man who called himself King of Valusia seemed startled. A strange look of doubt, almost of fear, clouded his eyes. Then he laughed.
Good. Lead on, wizard.
But now Bran took charge. He had recovered himself and was at ease. Whether he thought, like Cormac, that this was all a gigantic hoax arranged by Gunnar, he showed no sign.
King Kull, see you those men yonder, who lean on their long-shafted axes as they gaze upon you?
The tall men, with the golden hair and beards.
Aye. Our success in the coming battle hinges on them. They swear to go over to the enemy if we give them not a king to lead them, their own having been slain. Will you lead them to battle?
Kull's eyes glowed with appreciation.
They are men such as my own Red Slayers, my picked regiment. I will lead them. Come then.
The small group made their way down the slope, through throngs of warriors who pushed forward eagerly to get a better view of the stranger, then pressed back as he approached. An undercurrent of tense whispering ran through the horde. The Northmen stood apart in a compact group. Their cold eyes took in Kull, and he gave back their stares, taking in every detail of their appearance.
Wolfir, said Bran, we have brought you a king. I hold you to your oath. Let him speak to us,
said the Viking, harshly.
He cannot speak your tongue,
answered Bran, knowing that the Northmen knew nothing of the legends of his race.
He is a great king of the south.
He comes out of the past,
broke in the wizard, calmly.
He was the greatest of all kings, long ago.
A dead man.
The Vikings moved uneasily, and the rest of the horde pressed forward, drinking in every word. But Wolfir scowled.
Shall a ghost lead living men? You bring us a man you say is dead. We will not follow a corpse.
Wolfir, said Bran, in still passion.
You are a liar and a traitor. You set us this task, thinking it impossible. You yearn to fight under the eagles of Rome. We have brought you a king, neither picked Gael nor Britain, and you deny your vow. Let him fight me then,
howled Wolfir in uncontrollable wrath, swinging his axe about his head in a glittering arc.
If your dead man overcomes me, then my people will follow you. If I overcome him, you shall let us depart in peace to the camp of the legions.
Good,
said the wizard.
Do you agree, wolves of the north?
A fierce yell and a brandishing of swords was the answer. Bran turned to Kull, who had stood silent, understanding nothing of what was said, but the Atlantean's eyes gleamed. Cormac felt that those cold eyes had looked on too many such scenes not to understand something of what had passed.
This warrior says you must fight him for leadership,
said Bran, and Kull, eyes glittering with glowing battle joy, nodded.
I guessed as much. Give us space.
A shield and a helmet, shouted Bran, but Kull shook his head.
I need none, he growled. Back and give us room to swing our steel.
Men pressed back on each side, forming a solid ring about the two men, who now approached each other warily. Kull had drawn his sword, and the great blade shimmered like a live thing in his hand. Wulfir, scarred by 100 savage fights, flung aside his wolfskin mantle and came in cautiously, fierce eyes peering over the top of his outthrust shield, axe half lifted in his right hand. Suddenly, when the warriors were still many feet apart, Kull sprang. His attack brought a gasp from the men used to deeds of prowess, for like a leaping tiger he shot through the air and his sword crashed on the quickly lifted shield. Sparks flew and Wulfir's axe hacked in, but Kull was under its sweep, and as it swished viciously above his head, he thrust upward and sprang out again, cat-like. His motions had been too quick for the eye to follow. The upper edge of Wulfir's shield showed a deep cut, and there was a long rent in his mail shirt, where Kull's sword had barely missed the flesh beneath. Cormac, trembling with the terrible thrill of the fight, wondered at this sword that could thus slice through scale mail, and the blow that gashed the shield should have shattered the blade, yet not a notch showed in the Valusian steel. Surely this blade was forged by another people in another age. Now the two giants leapt again to the attack, and like double strokes of lightning their weapons crashed. Wulfir's shield fell from his arm in 2 pieces, as the Atlantean sword sheared clear through it, and Kull staggered as the Northman's axe, driven with all the force of his great body, descended on the golden circlet about his head. That blow should have sheared through the gold like butter, to split the skull beneath, but the axe rebounded, showing a great notch in its edge. The next instant, the Northman was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of steel, a storm of strokes delivered with such swiftness and power that he was borne back, as on the crest of a wave, unable to launch an attack of his own. With all his tried skill, he sought to parry the singing steel with his axe, but he could only avert his doom for a few seconds, could only for an instant turn the whistling blade that hewed off bits of his mail. So close fell the blows. One of the horns flew from his helmet, then the axe head itself fell away, and the same blow that severed the handle bit through the Viking's helmet into the scalp beneath. Wulfir was dashed to his knees, a trickle of blood starting down his face. Kull checked his second stroke, and tossing his sword to Cormac, faced the dazed Northman weaponless. The Atlantean's eyes were blazing with ferocious joy, and he roared something in a strange tongue.
Oh, Vaka, witness me!
Wulfir gathered his legs under him and bounded up, snarling like a wolf, a dagger flashing into his hand. The watching horde gave tongue in a yell that ripped the skies as the two bodies clashed. Kull's clutching hand missed the Northman's wrist, but the desperately lunging dagger snapped on the Atlantean's mail, and dropping the useless hilt, Wulfir locked his arms about his foe in a bear-like grip that would have crushed the ribs of a lesser man. Kull grinned tigerishly and returned the grapple, and for a moment the two swayed on their feet. Slowly, the black-haired warrior bent his foe backward, until it seemed his spine would snap. With a howl that had nothing of the human in it, Wulfir clawed frantically at Kull's face, trying to tear out his eyes, then turned his head and snapped his fang-like teeth into the Atlantean's arm. A yell went up as a trickle of blood started.
He bleeds! He bleeds! He is no ghost after all, but immortal man!
Angered, Kull shifted his grip, shoving the frothing Wulfir away from him, and smote him terrifically under the ear with his right hand. The Viking landed on his back a dozen feet away. Then, howling like a wild man, he leapt up with a stone in his hand and flung it. Only Kull's incredible quickness saved his face. As it was, the rough edge of the missile tore his cheek and inflamed him to madness.
Ha!
With a lion-like roar, he bounded upon his foe, enveloped him in an irresistible blast of sheer fury, whirled him high above his head as if he were a child, and cast him a dozen feet away. Wulfir pitched on his head and lay still, broken and dead. Dazed silence regained for an instant. Then, from the gales went up a thundering roar, and the Britons and Picts took it up, howling like wolves, until the echoes of the shouts and the clangour of sword on shield reached the ears of the marching legionaries miles to the south.
Men of the Grey North,
shouted Bran.
will you hold by your oath now?
The fierce souls of the Northmen were in their eyes as their spokesman answered. Primitive, superstitious, steeped in tribal lore of fighting gods and mythical heroes, they did not doubt that the black-haired fighting man was some supernatural being, sent by the fierce gods of battle.
Aye, such a man as this we have never seen. Dead man, ghost or devil, we will follow him, whether the trail lead to Rome or to Valhalla.
Kull understood the meaning, if not the words. Taking his sword from Cormac with a word of thanks, he turned to the waiting Northmen and silently held the blade toward them, high above his head, in both hands, before he returned it to its scabbard. Without understanding, they appreciated the action. Blood-stained and dishevelled, he was an impressive picture of stately, magnificent barbarism.
Come,
said Bran, touching the Atlantean's arm.
a host is marching on us, and we have much to do. There is scant time to arrange our forces before they will be upon us. Come to the top of yonder slope.
There, the Pict pointed. They were looking down into a valley which ran north and south, widening from a narrow gorge in the north until it debouched upon a plain to the south. The whole valley was less than a mile in length.
Up this valley our foes will come, said the Pict, because they have wagons loaded with supplies, and on all sides of this vale. The ground is too rough for such travel. Here we plan an ambush.
I would have thought you would have had your men lying in wait long before now,
said Kull.
What are the scouts the enemy is sure to send out?
The savages I lead would never have waited in ambush so long,
said Bran with a touch of bitterness.
I could not post them until I was sure of the Northmen. Even so, I had not dared to post them ere now. Even yet they may take panic, from the drifting of a cloud, or the blowing of a leaf, and scatter like birds before a cold wind. King Kull, the fate of the Pictish nation is at stake. I am called King of the Picts, but my rule as yet is but a hollow mockery. The hills are full of wild clans who refuse to fight for me. Of the 1,000 bowmen now at my command, more than half are of my own clan. Some 1,800 Romans march against us. It is not a real invasion, but much hinges upon it. It is the beginning of an attempt to extend their boundaries. They plan to build a fortress, a day's march to the north of this valley. If they do, they will build other forts, drawing bands of steel about the hearts of the free people. If I win this battle and wipe out this army, I will win a double victory. Then the tribes will flock to me, and the next invasion will meet a solid wall of resistance. If I lose, the clans will scatter, fleeing into the north, until they can no longer flee, fighting as separate clans rather than as one strong nation. I have 1,000 archers, 500 horsemen, 50 chariots with their drivers and swordsmen, 150 men in all, and, thanks to you, 300 heavily armed northern pirates. How would you arrange your battle lines?
Well, said Kull, I would have barricaded the north end of the valley. No, that would suggest a trap. But I would block it with a band of desperate men, like those you have given me to lead. 300 could hold the gorge for a time against any number. Then, when the enemy was engaged with these men to the narrow part of the valley, I would have my archers shoot down into them until their ranks are broken, from both sides of the vale. Then, having my horsemen concealed behind one ridge and my chariots behind the other, I would charge with both simultaneously and sweep the foe into a red ruin. Bran's eyes glowed. Exactly. King of Valusia. Such was my exact plan. But what of the scouts? My warriors are like panthers. They hide under the noses of the Romans. Those who ride into the valley will see only what we wish them to see. Those who ride over the ridge will not come back to report. An arrow is swift and silent. You see that the pivot of the whole thing depends on the men that hold the gorge. They must be men who can fight on foot and resist the charges of the heavy legionaries long enough for the trap to be closed. Outside these Northmen, I had no such force of men. My naked warriors with their short swords could never stand such a charge for an instant. Nor is the armour of the Celts made for such work. Moreover, they are not foot fighters, and I need them elsewhere. So you see why I had such desperate need of the Northmen. Now will you stand in the gorge with them and hold back the Romans until I can spring the trap? Remember, most of you will die. Kull smiled. I have taken chances all my life, though two, Chief Counselor, would say my life belongs to Valusia, and I have no right to so risk it. His voice trailed off, and a strange look flitted across his face. By Valka, he said, laughing uncertainly. Sometimes I forget this is a dream. All seems so real. But it is. Of course it is. Well then, if I die, I will but awaken, as I have done in times past. Lead on, King of Caledon. Cormac, going to his warriors, wondered. Surely it was all a hoax. Yet he heard the arguments of the warriors all about him, as they armed themselves and prepared to take their posts. The black-haired king was Nade himself, the Celtic war god. He was an antediluvian king brought out of the past by Gunnar. He was a mythical, fighting man out of Valhalla. He was no man at all, but a ghost. No, he was mortal, for he had bled. But the gods themselves bled, though they did not die. So the controversies raged. At least, thought Cormac, if it was all a hoax to inspire the warriors, with a feeling of supernatural aid, it had succeeded. The belief that Kull was more than a mortal man had fired Celt, Pict and Viking alike into a sort of inspired madness. And Cormac asked himself, what did he himself believe? This man was surely one from some far land. Yet in every look and action there was a vague hint of a greater difference than mere distance of space. A hint of alien time, of misty abysses and gigantic gulfs of eons lying between the black-haired stranger and the men with whom he walked and talked.
Oh, is he a ghost? Oh, is he a god?
Clouds of bewilderment mazed Cormac's brain.
Oh, I don't know.
And he laughed in whimsical self-mockery.
Oh, dear.
3. And the two wild peoples of the north stood fronting in the gloam, and heard and knew each in his mind a third great sound upon the wind, the living walls that hedge mankind, the walking walls of Rome. Chesterton. The sun slanted westward. Silence lay like an invisible mist over the valley. Cormac gathered the reins in his hand and glanced up at the ridges on both sides. The waving heather which grew rank on those steep slopes gave no evidence of the hundreds of savage warriors who lurked there. Here in the narrow gorge, which widened gradually southward, was the only sign of life. Between the steep walls, 300 Northmen were massed, solidly, in their wedge-shaped shield wall, blocking the pass. At the tip, like the point of a spear, stood the man who called himself Kull, King of Valusia. He wore no helmet, only the great, strangely worked headband of hard gold. But he bore on his left arm the great shield borne by the dead Ragnar, and in his right hand he held the heavy iron mace wielded by the Sea King. The Vikings eyed him in wonder and savage admiration. They could not understand his language, or he theirs, but no further orders were necessary. At Bran's directions, they had bunched themselves in the gorge, and their only order was, "Hold the pass." Bran MacMorn stood just in front of Kull, so they faced each other, he whose kingdom was yet unborn, and he whose kingdom had been lost in the mists of time for unguessed ages. Kings of darkness, thought Cormac, nameless kings of the night, whose realms are gulfs and shadows. The hand of the Pictish king went out. "King Kull, you are more than king. You are a man. Both of us may fall within the next hour. But if we both live, ask what you will of me." Kull smiled, returning the firm grip. "You two are a man after my own heart, King of the Shadows. Surely you are more than a figment of my sleeping imagination. Mayhap we will meet in the waking life some day." Bran shook his head in puzzlement, swung into the saddle and rode away, climbing the eastern slope and vanishing over the ridge. Cormac hesitated. "Strange man. Are you in truth of flesh and blood, or are you a ghost? When we dream, we are all flesh and blood, so long as we are dreaming," Kull answered. "This is the strangest nightmare I have ever known. But you, who will soon fade into sheer nothingness as I awaken, seem as real to me now as Brule, or Carnu, or Tu, or Kelkor." Cormac shook his head, as Bran had done, and with a last salute, which Kull returned with barbaric stateliness, he turned and trotted away. At the top of the western ridge he paused. Away to the south, a light cloud of dust rose, and the head of the marching column was in sight. Already he believed he could feel the earth vibrate slightly to the measured tread of 1,000 mailed feet, beating in perfect unison. He dismounted, and one of his chieftains, Domhnall, took his steed and led it down the slope away from the valley, where trees grew thickly. Only an occasional vague movement among them gave evidence of the 500 men who stood there, each at his horse's head, with a ready hand to check a chance nicker. Oh, thought Cormac, the gods themselves made this valley for Bran's ambush. The floor of the valley was treeless, and the inner slopes were bare save for the waist-high heather. But at the foot of each ridge, on the side facing away from the vale, where the soil long washed from the rocky slopes had accumulated, there grew enough trees to hide 500 horsemen, or 50 chariots. At the northern end of the valley stood Kull and his 300 Vikings, in open view, flanked on each side by 50 Pictish bowmen. Hidden on the western side of the western ridge were the Gaels. Along the top of the slopes, concealed in the tall heather, lay 100 Picts with their shafts on strings. The rest of the Picts were hidden on the eastern slopes, beyond which lay the Britons, with their chariots in full readiness. Neither they nor the Gaels to the west could see what went on in the vale, but signals had been arranged. Now the column was entering the wide mouth of the valley, and their scouts, lightly armed men on swift horses, were spreading out between the slopes. They galloped almost within bowshot of the silent host that blocked the pass, then halted. Some whirled and raced back to the main force, while the others deployed and cantered up the slopes, seeking to see what lay beyond. This was the crucial moment. If they got any hint of the ambush, all was lost. Cormac, shrinking down into the heather, marvelled at the ability of the Picts to efface themselves from view so completely. He saw a horseman pass within 3 feet of where he knew a bowman lay, yet the Roman saw nothing. The scouts topped the ridges, gazed about, then most of them turned and trotted back down the slopes. Cormac wondered at their desultory manner of scouting. He had never fought Romans before, knew nothing of their arrogant self-confidence, of their incredible shrewdness in some ways, their incredible stupidity in others. These men were overconfident, a feeling radiating from their officers. It had been years since a force of Caledonians had stood before the legions, and most of these men were newly come to Britain, part of a legion which had been quartered in Egypt. They despised their foes and suspected nothing. But stay. 3 riders on the opposite ridge had turned and vanished on the other side. And now one, sitting his steed at the crest of the western ridge, not 100 yards from where Cormac lay, looked long and narrowly down into the mass of trees at the foot of the slope. Cormac saw suspicion grow on his brown, hawk-like face. He half-turned, as though to call to his comrades, then instead reined his steed down the slope, leaning forward in his saddle. Cormac's heart pounded. Each moment he expected to see the man wheel and gallop back to raise the alarm. He resisted a mad impulse to leap up and charge the Roman on foot. Surely the man could feel the tenseness in the air, the hundreds of fierce eyes upon him. Now he was halfway down the slope, out of sight of the men in the valley, and now the twang of an unseen bow broke the painful stillness. With a strangled gasp, the Roman flung his hands high, and as the steed reared, he pitched headlong, transfixed by a long, black arrow that had flashed from the heather. A stocky dwarf sprang out of nowhere, seemingly, and seized the bridle, quieting the snorting horse, and leading it down the slope. At the fall of the Roman, short, crooked men rose like a sudden flight of birds from the grass, and Cormac saw the flash of a knife. Then with an unreal suddenness, all had subsided. Slayers and slain were unseen, and only the still waving heather marked the grim deed. The Gael looked back into the valley. The 3 who had ridden over the eastern ridge had not come back, and Cormac knew they never would. Evidently, the other scouts had borne word that only a small band of warriors were ready to dispute the passage of the legionaries. Now the head of the column was almost below him, and he thrilled at the sight of these men who were doomed, swinging along with their superb arrogance. And the sight of their splendid armour, their hawk-like faces, and perfect discipline awed him as much as it is possible for a Gael to be awed. 1,200 men in heavy armour, who marched as one, so that the ground shook to their tread. Most of them were middle height, with powerful chests and shoulders and bronzed faces, hard-bitten veterans of 100 campaigns. Cormac noted their javelins, short keen swords and heavy shields, their gleaming armour and crested helmets, the eagles on the standards. These were men beneath whose tread the world had shaken, and empires crumbled. Not all were Latins. There were Romanized Britons among them, and 1 century or 100 was composed of huge, yellow-haired men, Gauls and Germans, who fought for Rome as fiercely as did the native-born, and hated their wilder kinsmen more savagely. On each side was a swarm of cavalry, outriders, and the column was flanked by archers and slingers. A number of lumbering wagons carried the supplies of the army. Cormac saw the commander riding in his place, a tall man with a lean, imperious face, evident even at this distance. Marcus Silius. The Gaul knew him by reputation. A deep-throated roar rose from the legionaries as they approached their foes. Evidently, they intended to slice their way through and continue without pause, for the column moved implacably on. Whom the gods destroy, they first make mad. Cormac had never heard the phrase, but it came to him that the great Silius was a fool. Roman arrogance. Marcus was used to lashing the cringing peoples of a decadent East. Little he guessed of the iron in these Western races. A group of cavalry detached itself and raced into the mouth of the gorge. But it was only a gesture. With loud, jeering shouts they wheeled, 3 spears' length away, and cast their javelins, which rattled harmlessly on the overlapping shields of the silent Northmen. But their leader dared too much. Swinging in, he leaned from his saddle and thrust at Kull's face. The great shield turned the lance, and Kull struck back as a snake strikes. The ponderous mace crushed helmet and head like an eggshell, and the very steed went to its knees from the shock of that terrible blow. From the Northmen went up a short, fierce roar, and the Picts behind them howled exultantly and loosed their arrows among the retreating horsemen. First blood for the people of the Heather. The oncoming Romans shouted vengefully and quickened their pace as the frightened horses raced by. A ghastly travesty of a man, foot caught in the stirrup, trailing beneath the pounding hoofs. Now the first line of the legionaries, compressed because of the narrowness of the gorge, crashed against the solid wall of shields, crashed and recoiled upon itself. The shield wall had not shaken an inch. This was the first time the Roman legions had met with that unbreakable formation, that oldest of all Aryan battle lines, the ancestor of the Spartan regiment, the Theban phalanx, the Macedonian formation, the English square. Shield crashed on shield, and the short Roman sword sought for an opening in that iron wall. Viking spears, bristling in solid ranks above, thrust and reddened. Heavy axes chopped down, shearing through iron, flesh and bone. Cormac saw Kull, looming above the stocky Romans in the forefront of the fray, dealing blows like thunderbolts. A burly centurion rushed in, shield held high, stabbing upward. The iron mace crashed terribly, shivering the sword, rending the shield apart, shattering the helmet, crushing the skull down between the shoulders in a single blow. The front line of the Romans bent like a steel bar about the wedge, as the legionaries sought to struggle through the gorge on each side and surround their opposers. But the pass was too narrow. Crouching close against the steep walls, the Picts drove their black arrows in a hail of death. At this range, the heavy shafts tore through shield and corselet, transfixing the armoured men. The front line of battle rolled back, red and broken, and the Northmen trod their few dead underfoot to close the gaps their fall had made. Stretched the full width of their front line lay a thin line of shattered forms, the red spray of the tide which had broken upon them in vain. Cormac had leapt to his feet, waving his arms. Domhnall and his men broke cover at the signal, and came galloping up the slope lining the ridge. Cormac mounted the horse brought him, and glanced impatiently across the narrow vale. No sign of life appeared on the eastern ridge. Where was Bran and the Britons? Down in the valley, the legions, angered at the unexpected opposition of the paltry force in front of them, but not suspicious, were forming in a more compact body. The wagons which had halted were lumbering on again, and the whole column was once more in motion as if it intended to crash through by sheer weight. With the Gaulish century in the forefront, the legionaries were advancing again in the attack, this time with the full force of 1,200 men behind. The charge would batter down the resistance of Kull's warriors like a heavy ram, would stamp them down, sweep over their red ruins. Cormac's men trembled in impatience. Suddenly Marcus Tullius turned and gazed westward, where the line of horsemen was etched against the sky. Even at that distance, Cormac saw his face pale. The Roman at last realized the mettle of the men he faced, and that he had walked into a trap. Surely in that moment there flashed a chaotic picture through his brain. Defeat, disgrace, red ruin. It was too late to retreat, too late to form into a defensive square with the wagons for barricade. There was but one possible way out, and Marcus, crafty general in spite of his recent blunder, took it. Cormac heard his voice cut like a clarion through the din, and though he did not understand the words, he knew that the Roman was shouting for his men to smite that knot of Northmen like a blast, to hack their way through and out of the trap before it could close. Now the legionaries, aware of their desperate plight, flung themselves headlong and terribly on their foes. The shield wall rocked, but it gave not an inch. The wild faces of the Gauls and the hard brown Italian faces glared over locked shields into the blazing eyes of the north. Shields touching, they smote and slew and died in a red storm of slaughter, where crimsoned axes rose and fell and dripping spears broke on notched swords. Where in God's name was Bran with his chariots? A few minutes more would spell the doom of every man who held that pass. Already they were falling fast, though they locked their ranks closer and held like iron. Those wild men of the north were dying in their tracks, and looming above their golden heads, the black lion mane of Kull shone like a symbol of slaughter, and his reddened mace showered a ghastly rain as it splashed brains and blood like water. Something snapped in Cormac's brain.
"These men will die while we wait for Bran's signal,"
he shouted.
"On! Follow me into hell! Sons of Kull!
A wild roar answered him, and loosening rein, he shot down the slope with 500 yelling riders plunging headlong after him. And even at that moment, a storm of arrows swept the valley from either side like a dark cloud, and the terrible clamour of the Picts split the skies. And over the eastern ridge, like a sudden burst of rolling thunder on Judgment Day, rushed the war chariots. Headlong down the slope they roared, foam flying from the horses' distended nostrils, frantic feet scarcely seeming to touch the ground, making naught of the tall heather. In the foremost chariot, with his dark eyes blazing, crouched Bran MacMorn, and in all of them the naked Britons were screaming and lashing as if possessed by demons. Behind the flying chariots came the Picts, howling like wolves and loosing their arrows as they ran. The heather belched them forth from all sides in a dark wave. So much Cormac saw, in chaotic glimpses during that wild ride down the slopes. A wave of cavalry swept between him and the main line of the column. 3 long leaps ahead of his men, the Gaelic princes met the spears of the Roman riders. The first lance turned on his buckler, and rising in his stirrups he smote downward, cleaving his man from shoulder to breastbone. The next Roman flung a javelin that killed Domhnall, but in that instant Cormac's steed crashed into his, breast to breast, and the lighter horse rolled headlong under the shock, flinging his rider beneath the pounding hooves. Then the whole blast of the Gaelic charge smote the Roman cavalry, shattering it, crashing and rolling it down and under. Over its red ruins, Cormac's yelling demons struck the heavy Roman infantry, and the whole line reeled at the shock. Swords and axes flashed up and down, and the force of their rush carried them deep into the massed ranks. Here checked, they swayed and strove. Javelins thrust, swords flashed upwards, bringing down horse and rider, and greatly outnumbered, leaguered on every side. The Gaels had perished among their foes, but at that instant, from the other side, the crashing chariots smote the Roman ranks. In one long line they struck, almost simultaneously, and at the moment of the impact, the charioteers wheeled their horses sidelong and raced parallel down the ranks, shearing men down like the mowing of wheat. Hundreds died on those curving blades in that moment, and leaping from the chariots, screaming like blood-mad wildcats, the British swordsmen flung themselves upon the spears of the legionaries, hacking madly with their 2-handed swords. Crouching, the Picts drove their arrows point blank, and then sprang in to slash and thrust. Maddened with the sight of the victory, these wild people were like wounded tigers, feeling no wounds, and dying on their feet with their last gasp a snarl of fury. But the battle was not over yet. Dazed, shattered, their formation broken and nearly half their number down already, the Romans fought back with desperate fury. Hemmed in on all sides, they slashed and smote singly, or in small clumps, fought back to back. Archers, slingers, horsemen and heavy legionnaires mingled into a chaotic mass. The confusion was complete, but not of victory. Those bottled in the gorge still hurled themselves upon the red axes that barred their way, while the massed and serried battle thundered behind them. From one side, Cormac's Gaels raged and slashed. From the other, chariots swept back and forth, retiring and returning like iron whirlwinds. There was no retreat, for the Picts had flung a cordon across the way they had come, and having cut the throats of the camp followers and possessed themselves of the wagon, they sent their shafts in a storm of death into the rear of the shattered column. Those long black arrows pierced armour and bone, nailing men together. Yet the slaughter was not all on one side. Picts died beneath the lightning thrust of javelin and short sword, Gales pinned beneath their falling horses were hewed to pieces, and chariots cut loose from their horses were deluged with the blood of the charioteers. And at the narrow head of the valley still the battle surged and eddied. Great gods, thought Cormac, glancing between lightning-like blows. Do these men still hold the gorge? Aye, they held it. 1/10 of their original number, dying on their feet, they still held back the frantic charges of the dwindling legionaries. Over all the field went up the roar and clash of arms. And birds of prey, swift flying out of the sunset, circled above. Cormac, striving to reach Marcus Sullius through the press, saw the Roman's horse sink under him, and the rider rise alone in a waste of foes. He saw the Roman sword flash thrice, dealing a death at each blow. Then from the thickest of the fray bounded a terrible figure. It was Bran MacMorn, stained from head to foot. He cast away his broken sword as he ran, drawing a dirk. The Roman struck, but the Pictish king was under the thrust, and gripping the sword wrist, he drove the dirk again and again through the gleaming armour. A mighty roar went up as Marcus died, and Cormac, with a shout, rallied the remnants of his force about him, and, striking in the spurs, burst through the shattered lines and rode full speed for the other end of the valley. But as he approached, he saw that he was too late. As they had lived, so had they died, those fierce sea-wolves, with their faces to the foe and their broken weapons red in their hands. In a grim and silent band they lay, even in death preserving some of the shield wall formation. Among them, in front of them and all about them, lay high-heaped the bodies of those who had sought to break them, in vain. They had not given back a foot. To the last man, they had died in their tracks, nor were there any left to stride over their torn shapes. Those Romans who had escaped the Vikings' axes had been struck down by the shafts of the Picts and the swords of the Gaels from behind. Yet this part of the battle was not over. High up on the steep western slope, Cormac saw the ending of that drama. A group of Gauls in the armour of Rome pressed upon a single man, a black-haired giant, on whose head gleamed a golden crown. There was iron in these men, as well as in the man who had held them to their fate. They were doomed. Their comrades were being slaughtered behind them, but before their turn came, they would at least have the life of the black-haired chief who had led the golden-haired men of the north. Pressing upon him from three sides, they had forced him slowly back up the steep gorge wall, and the crumpled bodies that stretched along his retreat showed how fiercely every foot of the way had been contested. Here on this steep, it was task enough to keep one's footing alone, yet these men at once climbed and fought. Kull's shield and the huge mace were gone, and the great sword in his right hand was dyed crimson. His mail, wrought with a forgotten art, now hung in shreds, and the blood steamed from 100 wounds on limbs, head, and body. But his eyes still blazed with the battle joy, and his wearied arm still drove the mighty blade in strokes of death. But Cormac saw that the end would come before they could reach him. Now at the very crest of the steep, a hedge of points menaced the strange king's life, and even his iron strength was ebbing. Now he split the skull of a huge warrior, and the backstroke shore through the neck cords of another. Reeling under a very rain of swords, he struck again, and his victim dropped at his feet, cleft to the breastbone. Then, even as a dozen swords rose above the staggering Atlantean for the deathstroke, a strange thing happened. The sun was sinking into the western sea. All the heather swam red like an ocean of blood. Etched in the dying sun as he had first appeared, Kull stood, and then, like a mist lifting, a mighty vista opened behind the reeling king. Cormac's astounded eyes caught a fleeting, gigantic glimpse of other climes and spheres. As if mirrored in summer clouds, he saw, instead of the heather hills stretching away to the sea, a dim and mighty land of blue mountains and gleaming, quiet lakes. The golden, purple and sapphirine spires and towering walls of a mighty city, such as the earth had not known for many a drifting age. Then, like the fading of a mirage, it was gone. But the Gauls on the high slope had dropped their weapons and stared like dazed men, for the man called Kull had vanished, and there was no trace of his going. As in a daze, Cormac turned his steed and rode back across the trampled field, his horse's hoofs splashing in lakes of blood and clanged against the helmets of dead men. Across the valley, the shout of victory was thundering, yet all seemed shadowy and strange. A shape was striding across the torn corpses, and Cormac was dully aware that it was Bran. The Gael swung from his horse and fronted the king. Bran was weaponless and gory. Blood trickled from gashes on brow, breast and limb. What armour he had worn was clean hacked away, and a cut had shorn halfway through his iron crown. But the jewel still gleamed, unblemished like a star of slaughter.
It is in my mind to slay you,
said the Gael, heavily and like a man speaking in a daze.
For the blood of brave men is on your head. Had you given the signal to charge sooner, some would have lived.
Bran folded his arms. His eyes were haunted.
Strike if you will. I am sick of slaughter. It is a cold mead, this kinging it. A king must gamble with men's lives and naked swords. The lives of my people were at stake. I sacrificed the Northmen, yes. And my heart is sore within me, for they were men. But I had given the order. But had I given the order when you would have desired, all might have gone awry. The Romans were not yet amassed in the narrow mouth of the gorge, and might have had time and space to form their ranks again and beat us off. I waited until the last moment, and the rovers died. A king belongs to his people, and cannot let either his own feelings or the lives of men influence him. Now my people are saved, but my heart is cold in my breast.
Cormac wearily dropped his sword point to the ground.
You're a born king of men, Bran,
said the Gaelic prince. Bran's eyes roved the field. A mist of blood hovered over all, where the victorious barbarians were looting the dead, while those Romans who had escaped slaughter by throwing down their swords and now stood under guard looked on with hot, smouldering eyes.
My kingdom, my people, are saved, said Bran wearily. They will come from the heather, by the thousands, and when Rome moves against us again, she will meet a solid nation. But I am weary. What of Kull?
My eyes and brain were mazed with battle,
answered Cormac.
I thought to see him vanish like a ghost into the sunset. I will seek his body.
Seek not for him,
said Bran.
Out of the sunrise he came. Into the sunset he is gone. Out of the mists of the ages he came to us. And back into the mists of the eons he has returned. To his own kingdom.
Cormac turned away. Night was gathering. Gunnar stood like a white spectre before him.
"To his own kingdom,"
Echoed the wizard.
"time and space are not. Kull has returned to his own kingdom, his own crown, his own age."
Then he was a ghost.
Did you not feel the grip of his solid hand? Did you not hear his voice, see him eat and drink, laugh and slay and bleed?
Still Cormac stood like one in a trance. Then if it be possible for a man to pass from one age into one yet unborn, or come forth from a century dead and forgotten, whichever you will, with his flesh and blood body and his arms, then he was as mortal as he was in his own day. Is Kull dead then?
He died 100,000 years ago, as men reckon time,
Answered the wizard.
but in his own age he died not from the swords of the Gauls of this age. Have we not heard in legends how the king of Volusia travelled into a strange, timeless land of the misty future ages, and there fought in a great battle? Why, so he did, 100,000 years ago, or today. And 100,000 years ago, or a moment agone, Kull, king of Volusia, roused himself on the silken couch in his secret chamber, and laughing spoke to the first Gunnar, saying,
"Ha! Wizard, I have in truth dreamed strangely, for I went into a far clime and a far time in my vision, and fought for the king of a strange shadow people."
And the great sorcerer smiled, and pointed silently at the red-notched sword, and the torn mail, and the many wounds the king carried. And Kull, fully awoken from his vision, and feeling the sting and the weakness of these yet bleeding wounds, fell silent and mazed, and all life and time and space seemed like a dream of ghosts to him, and he wondered thereat all the rest of his life. For the wisdom of the eternities is denied even unto princes, and Kull could no more understand what Gunnar told him than you can understand my words.
And then Kull lived, despite of his many wounds, said Cormac.
And has returned to the mists of silence and the centuries. Well, he thought us a dream, and we thought him a ghost. And sure, life is but a web spun of ghosts and dreams and illusion. And it is in my mind that the kingdom which has this day been born, of swords and slaughter in this howling valley, is a thing no more solid than the foam of the bright sea.
thank you for listening. For updates, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Images courtesy of Unsplash.com. Audio courtesy of YouTube Audio Library. Links and artist creditation in the description. Please like, comment, share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell.